Okay, so here we are for our second part of Chapter 14, Acids and Bases. So in our first video, we talked a little bit about common acids and bases, some of the properties that acids share, some of the properties that all bases share, and now, and then we talked a little bit about the Arrhenius definition of acids and bases, basically that an Arrhenius acid produces the H plus ion when dissolved in water, and that an Arrhenius base produces the OH minus ion when dissolved in water. However, we talked about how that definition was very limited about acids and bases, so that it talked about that acid-base reactions, therefore, were always happening in solution, which we know is not true, and that bases always had to have that OH minus ion in their chemical formula. However, we know that's not true either. So in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about the Bronsted-Lowry definition of acids and bases to kind of make up for some of those shortfallings of the Arrhenius definition, which leads us into a discussion about conjugate acids and bases as well. And we're also going to talk about how to identify strong and weak acids and bases along the way. I've stuck a little comic in here. I hope you guys like it. You can go ahead and check it out in your lecture slides. But this is kind of how I picture us a little bit in the lab this week as we're doing our titrations. But let's be careful not to spill. Let me know if you have spills, kind of a deal. But dubstep's always allowed in the lab. So good going. So back to the chemistry. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Bronsted-Lowry definition of acids and bases. You might notice that Bronsted is spelled with this kind of symbol, this O looking thing. I have left it out lots of places here for simplicity of typing and continuing to put together this presentation. So know that technically the O looks like this. However, I have left it the way that it is now. We said before that the Arrhenius definition was quite limited, so what do we use instead? Well, we use this Bronsted-Lowry definition. So Bronsted and Lowry were two different scientists who developed this theory exactly at the same time without any information from each other. So they've both been given the name of this definition of an acid and base. So that's why we call it a Bronsted-Lowry acid-base definition. And I also want to make sure that you know, too, that all Arrhenius acids and bases are Bronsted-Lowry acids and bases, but it does not go the other way. So, for example, NH3 fits the ammonia, fits the definition of a Bronsted-Lowry base, but does not fit the definition of an Arrhenius base. So if you kind of think about it, how all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares, kind of the same thing here. All Arrhenius acids and bases are Bronsted-Lowry acids and bases, but not all Bronsted-Lowry acids and bases are Arrhenius acids and bases. It's a lot. So that's kind of the idea here. Bronsted-Lowry is a more general definition that we can actually use and leverage just a bit more. So instead of looking at the molecular formula and trying to figure out how these different compounds dissolve in water, so instead of looking at the actual chemical formula, the Bronsted-Lowry definition focuses on the movement or transfer of protons when the compounds react with water, for example. So a Bronsted-Lowry acid gives up, or does what we call donates a proton, and a Bronsted-Lowry base receives or accepts a proton. So, of course, by proton, I mean that cool definition of the H plus ion that we talked about in the first video. So, Bronsted-Lowry acids and bases are passing between them these H plus ions, or protons, you might think of them. So, Bronsted-Lowry acids are proton donors, meaning that they give up a proton. So a lot of times when we are looking at Bronsted-Lowry acids and bases, we're going to want to look at their chemical reaction with water to determine if they're an acid or a base, or how they're acting in this specific reaction. So, for example here, HCl, we considered it also to be an Arrhenius acid. So we know that when we dissolve it in water, it forms H plus and Cl minus. However, if we want to consider it to have a reaction with water, we could say that HCl plus H2O yields H3O plus and Cl minus. So if you're examining this chemical reaction and you're comparing the different chemical formulas here, my compound with HCl goes from being HCl to just this Cl minus ion by itself. So it gave up that proton. It gave up the H plus part of its chemical formula. So you're looking for this ion in your acid somewhere in your product side of your chemical reaction. So remember, your reactants on the left, your products on the right-hand side of the arrow. So if I see HCl over here as a reactant, and then I see it over here without that proton, and now it's just the Cl minus ion, then I know that it's acting as a Bronsted-Lowry acid. So here you can see that H2O goes from being H2O to H3O plus, so it's increased its number of protons, so it's not acting as a Bronsted-Lowry acid in this case. It's a base in this case. Side note. So when we're looking at this reaction, the HCl gives a proton to H2O, giving us H3O plus and Cl minus. So you can think of this as HCl reacts with water to form H3O plus, and if we see that H3O plus, it's also an indicator we have an acid. So Bronsted-Lowry acids are proton donors. They're going to somehow, some way give up one of their protons, give up that acidic, that out front H plus ion, and it's going to donate it to the base in the reaction. So you could think of this either as that transfer of a proton, or HCl reacts with water to form H3O plus. In contrast, Bronsted-Lowry bases are proton acceptors. So they take the proton that the acid has given up, basically. So the acid gives up its proton, the base says, hey, I want that proton, give me that proton, and it takes the proton from the acid. So you can identify Bronsted-Lowry bases by looking at their chemical reactions with water as well. So we're looking for something that accepts a proton. So here we have NH3, which is ammonia. This is our discussion of why ammonia is a base. So NH3 takes one of those protons from water so that it becomes NH4 plus. So I went from having 3 hydrogens to having 4. That's a proton acceptance move. And then my water goes from being H2O, it gave up that proton to become OH minus, so it has 1 less proton. It's an acid here, for example. We'll talk about that later. So here you see that the ammonia, NH3, accepts that H plus proton from water, which you can also think of it as saying the NH3 reacts with water to form OH minus. So if you see that OH minus in your products, it can also be a hint that you have a Bronsted-Lowry base reaction. So again, in these reactions, we're looking somewhere for that transfer of a proton. So here the NH3 has accepted the proton to make NH4 plus. So ammonia accepts a proton to become ammonium. So kind of cool. I also want to say that NaOH is still classified as a Bronsted-Lowry base. However, really, truly, it's those OH minus ions that are the base, okay? So when you're putting sodium hydroxide in water, remember it's going to fully dissociate into Na plus and OH minus when you put it in the water. So it's really these OH minuses that are in the water that are going to be able to accept a proton from an acid. So if it's able to accept a proton, the OH minus can take a proton. It'll form water when it does that. And so it's really the base in this situation. And the Na plus just kind of delivers the OH minus. So we have some sort of stable compound between NaOH. When we put it in water, it's able to dissociate. So I kind of like to think of it as just the partner that's dropping them off at work, and then the OH minus is going to go to work as a base, and then Na is just along for the ride in that case. So when we're thinking about NaOH or some of these other bases, they fit very well into that Arrhenius definition, but you kind of got to wiggle them into that Bronsted-Lowry acid-base definition. So when we're talking about Bronsted-Lowry acids and bases, they kind of leave a little bit of wiggle room in their definition for what's truly an acid or a base. So here, if we go back to looking at that reaction where we have NH3 and H2O, they're going to react to form NH plus, or NH4 plus and OH minus. However, if you kind of look at it backwards, you can kind of see here that NH4 plus, that's going to give up a proton to become NH3, and OH minus is going to take that proton to become H2O. Wait, what did I do there? Why did I go backwards? Oh, that's uncomfy, right? That's not fun. So we kind of, if you made some of these statements early in the semester, I may have tempered your statements a little bit, because one of the things that we tend to learn very first about chemical reactions versus like the chemical processes versus physical processes, what we find is that a lot of times we think that chemical reactions are irreversible. You can't go back once you've done it. That's not really true once we really get down to the science and we fully understand what's happening. So it's mind-blowing. Some reactions really can go in reverse. So in this case, when you have NH3 and water, it's constantly going back and forth to make NH4 plus and OH minus. Those two are hitting each other, recombining to be NH3 and H2O. Then the NH3 and the H2O react to form NH plus or NH4 plus and OH minus. Then that NH4 plus and the OH minus go back and forth to form NH3 and H2O. What in the world am I talking about? So not all chemical reactions are set in stone and cannot be changed. So we might talk about them as forward and backward reactions here. So you may have noticed this cool little double reaction arrow I have drawn in here. We usually use a half arrow, so you'll want to make sure that's a half arrow. So you can go ahead and draw these in. And so what this means is that this kind of reaction, we can read it forwards, or we could read it backwards. So forwards and backwards are just relative terms. I could have written this opposite as well as I have written it down here. So forwards and backwards reactions are a possibility here. So it's kind of interesting to think about over here. NH3 is the base that forms NH4 plus, but NH4 plus is the acid that forms NH3, for example. So so basically, if we're looking at the compound, NH3 is a base, and it kind of has this acid that it forms that it kind of gets paired with. So we call these conjugate acids and base pairs. So for example, NH3 and NH4 plus are a conjugate acid-base pair. So NH3 is the base, and NH4 plus is the conjugate acid. So basically, we're looking at the reaction, and we have conjugate, or we can find our conjugate acid-base pairs because we can figure out what the base is, because that accepts a proton, and when it's already accepted that proton, it's like already in that mode where it has a proton. That's where we call it the conjugate acid. So if we look at our reaction that we were just checking out on the last slide, same one here, we have NH3 with its conjugate acid, NH4 plus. So we call that a conjugate acid-base pair. And really the difference between the two is always just a proton. So here water is acting as an acid. So if water is acting as an acid, its conjugate base is OH minus, for example. So it went from having the proton to losing the proton. So again, it's just the difference between a hydrogen, just the difference between a proton, just the difference between an H plus ion, for example. If we think about HNO3 and NO3 minus, they're another conjugate acid-base pair where HNO3 is the acid and NO3 minus is the conjugate base. I have another reaction written down here for you as well, where we have H2SO4, that's sulfuric acid, as our acid. We can see that when it's in water, it reacts with the water to form HSO4 minus. That's the conjugate base of that H2SO4, so it's kind of the ionized version even. And the H2O is a base in this case, and it forms the conjugate acid H3O plus. So we'll talk about this a little bit more in detail here, but H2O can act as an acid or a base, so we have to think about it as an acid to find its conjugate base or as a base to find its conjugate acid. So when we're talking about conjugate acid-base pairs, what we're just talking about is, all right, here's the base. What is it when it's in its acid mode? Okay, here's the acid. What is it when it's in its conjugate base mode? What does it look like when we've had that transfer of a proton? And remember, bases accept protons, so a base is going to have less protons than the conjugate acid, and an acid is going to have more protons than its conjugate base. So, a conjugate base is a base, so it still is a base even though we say conjugate base, and a conjugate acid is an acid. We use conjugate to kind of indicate which one's worse at its job, for example. So if something is really great at being an acid, its conjugate base is not very good at being a base, for example. So I have a cool little chart over here for you to check out and look at that has all these different conjugate acid-base pairs. And it's talking about its ability as a base or its ability as an acid. So as you move down into this more dark colored red zone, you have acid strength increasing. And over here, if you read from the bottom of the chart up to this dark blue area, that's base strength increasing. So for example, HCl, we know that's a very strong acid. We'll talk about how to determine if something's a strong acid, but this is a pretty strong acid, so that Cl minus basically doesn't even act as a base at all. So it is the conjugate base of HCl. HCl is the acid, Cl minus is the conjugate base. You can see those pairings all the way along here, but HCl is so good of an acid that Cl minus is not a very good conjugate base. When we're somewhere in the middle here with weak acids and weak bases, they kind of are a little bit good at both things, but they're just not great in acid-base reactions. So compounds tend to be stronger as an acid or a base, and we usually call, and therefore we call the opposite a conjugate. Sometimes, again, when we have weak acids and bases, they'll behave characteristically as both and not necessarily be very strong either way. Some species can act as both an acid and a base. We saw this with water before. We call these amphoteric compounds. So an amphoteric compound can both donate or accept a proton. So here we saw that water acts as an acid. It accepts the proton, or it gives the proton, acids donate protons. So here water acts as an acid. It donates a proton to NH3. So NH3 becomes NH4+. And if we compare the H2O to its conjugate base, it has one less proton in its conjugate base as OH-. So H2O can act as an acid in this case, but water can also act as a base. So here we see that it's able to accept a proton that H2SO4 is giving up to become that conjugate acid H3O+. So here we've used it to accept a proton and act as a base. So here it accepts the proton to become H3O+. There are certain things that we can see that act as both. The HCO3- ion bicarbonate also tends to be amphoteric. So it could take a proton from H3O+ to become H2CO3, or it could donate its proton to an OH-, for example, and become CO3, that should be 2- and H2O. So that's kind of how that works. So if a species can act as both, we call it amphoteric. Really the only amphoteric compound we're going to be working with in this class, it is going to be water. I just put carbonate up here as an example. So let's talk just a little bit about the strengths of acids and bases to finish on out here. Strong acids and bases have a very technical definition in chemistry. So what we're not talking about when we're talking about the strength of acids and bases is we're not talking about how bad they can hurt you or how corrosive they are, for example. Sometimes it tends to line up with that property. However, that's not really the definition of a strong acid or base in chemistry. So the technical definition that we use in chemistry to describe a strong acid or a strong base is strong acids and bases fully dissociate every molecule into their ions that's put into solution. So basically, when you put HCl in water, every single HCl ion dissociates and forms an H3O plus when it reacts with the water it's in, and a Cl minus. So if we're looking at the chemical reaction, we can tell that it's a strong acid because HCl plus H2O goes to H3O plus and Cl minus. But our big hint here is what I have circled on your screen. It's that forward reaction arrow. So basically it's saying that this is the entire reaction occurs, it only goes in one direction. So our forward reaction arrow, again, is different than that double reaction arrow that we saw. And this basically says it's only the forward reaction, it cannot go backward. If it cannot go backward, it's a strong acid or strong base. So you should be able to look at a drawing like this and see that all of the ions have fully dissociated. We don't see any HCl molecules in this solution that we drop in. Sorry, hold on, I'm in the way a little bit. So our HCl molecule looks like the one little white hydrogen with the big old green Cl minus. So when we put it in water, we see that it forms H3O plus, 1, 2, 3 hydrogens, 1 red oxygen. So that forms H3O plus in solution and Cl minus. And we no longer see any of those HCl molecules with a white little hydrogen and a green Cl with it. We see that every single one of them has fully come apart and we have all of them separate. So you could look at a picture, something like either of these drawings, or if we saw the chemical reaction, we would be able to look at the reaction arrow, see that it only goes in the forward direction, it can't go backwards, so that's an indication that it's a strong acid or base. Strong acids, for example, I have a list down here. It would be good of you to start to be able to recognize some of these as strong acids. There's not a whole lot here, but we'll definitely be looking at HCl, HBr, HI, nitric acid, HNO3, and so on and so forth. As far as strong bases go, we're always going to have those hydroxides. So anytime you see those hydroxide ions, that's your big ding, 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 ding red flag indicator you have a strong base. So please become familiar with some of these strong acids so that you might be able to identify them. And as well, know that if you see an OH minus or an OH in your chemical compound, that's going to be a strong base with that hydroxide. So in contrast, what's different about a weak acid or bases? Again, weak acids and bases also have this technical definition as well. So for example, hydrofluoric acid, HF, is a weak acid. So it's a weak acid in terms of that chemistry definition. We'll talk about why in a second. But it's really, really dangerous. It's super corrosive. It's not something we even usually like to work with as chemists because of how dangerous it is. Like it's a scary one to me. I don't know that I personally know anyone that's even worked with HF through my graduate school experience. I talked to a friend who was thinking about doing it once, but they went around the way to find another solution so they didn't have to work with it, so that it wasn't quite so dangerous of an experiment for them. So even though HF is technically considered a weak acid in terms of the acid-base definition in chemistry, it still can hurt you very badly, for example. And actually, HNO3, nitric acid that we just talked about as a strong acid that fully dissociates, that one, we use it in lab quite often. It's not quite so dangerous. So remembering that strong and weak has nothing to do with the danger. It has everything to do with the behavior of the molecules. So weak acids and bases do not fully dissociate every molecule into their ions. So you can tell if an acid or base is a strong acid or base, is a weak acid or base if the reaction arrow shows that double reaction indicating a forward and backward reaction occur. This should say weak. I apologize. So this should say weak. So you can tell if an acid or base is a weak acid or base if the reaction arrow indicates that double reaction arrow that shows that it could go forward or it could go backward. So basically, when we're thinking about that, so if I look at the forward reaction, it kind of shows that dissociation model. However, if my F minus and my H3O plus bump back into each other, they'll make that HF again. So in my solution, as many HF ions as I'm using up to make H3O plus and F minus, those two are recombining to make my original HF, and that HF is going back and forth to make that H3O plus F minus, to go back and forth to make that HF and water combo again. So if we're going back and forth, we can always expect to have some of those HF molecules in solution. So if we have some of those HF molecules in solution, we say that that acid or base does not, or like if we have some of the original compound in solution, we can say that that acid or base does not fully dissociate and is therefore a weak acid or base. So if you check this out here, we have HF being put into our beaker. We see that it does form some H3O plus ions and F minus ions. However, there are some HF actual compounds left. And then if we look at a drawing or picture of it, we have this light green here, fluorine, and this H attached to it, this hydrogen, so we have HF. So when we put it in solution, we see that we still have those original HF molecules, and we do have a couple of H3O plus and F minus ions as well. So it does break apart a bit, but it does not fully break apart every single molecule, and that's why it's considered to be a weak acid or base. A quick note about weak bases. So more specifically, it's kind of, again, really easy to identify a strong base with that OH minus ion in it. So weak bases don't start with the OH minus in its compound. It accepts a proton from water to form that OH minus instead. So weak bases form the OH minus in reaction, whereas strong bases already kind of have that OH minus in their chemical formula. So another indicator when we're looking at the chemical formulas of bases specifically, we can start to tell whether something's strong or weak in a base if it has that hydroxide OH minus ion in it. Okay, so just a quick peek here at some weak acids and bases. So we'll see them often on our tour of acids and bases. If you look at these chemical formulas of acids or of acids specifically, it's kind of hard to tell them apart from the strong acids. They all kind of look the same, okay? So it can be a little bit tougher to discern those strong acids from the weak acids. So it would do you some good to keep in mind that list of strong acids and this list of weak acids so that you can start to help tell them apart for yourself. But they'll always have that double reaction arrow in a reaction. If we're looking at pictures, we'll see that the weak acids don't fully dissociate. So those are the weak acids. And down here we can see that none of our weak bases have that OH minus ion in them. But you can see that often bases do have nitrogen in them. Nitrogen is kind of the part that ends up acting in a more basic manner. The further on definitions of acids and bases point to nitrogen being an awesome base. So maybe if it's a nitrogen-containing compound, it might ring a red flag that it might be a weak base or it might be a base. But you should always fully look into what chemical reaction it occurs. That occurs with water, so you can determine if it's an acid or a base, of course. So just keep that in mind as you're moving along here, and these are just some examples of weak acids and weak bases. You should be able to identify them from their chemical reaction. You should be able to identify what they look like in solution. So this is kind of the end of the background information about acids and bases. In the next video, we're going to move on to talking a little bit about how we can identify acids and bases in the lab. What are some of the more intrinsic properties and their concentrations and how they interact with water, and how we can use their interactions with water to determine if something is acidic or basic. So that's where we're headed next. So that was the Bronsted-Lowry definition of acids and bases, a discussion of conjugate acid and base pairs, as well as what a weak acid is, a weak base is, versus what a strong acid is, and a strong base. So